So good afternoon, everybody. This is Paula Ropaleski with Leading Age Virginia. Thank you for being on this webinar today on the COVID-19 vaccine update with PruittHealth Pharmacy Services. I just want to tell you a little bit about our speaker today, who has an incredible background. Michelle Ames earned her doctorate of pharmacy degree from Duquesne University's Milan School of Pharmacy in 2001. Upon graduation, she spent the first few years of her career working in community pharmacy before transitioning to the long-term care setting in 2003. So for the last 17 years, she's been engaged in long-term care practice with responsibilities spanning clinical tasks in the consulting arena to general manager over long-term care pharmacy operations. Dr. Ames arrived at Pruitt Health in 2015. She currently holds the position of Area Vice President of Pharmacy Operations at PruittHealth's Pharmacy Services in the Carolinas and Virginia. Dr. Ames is a member of the North Carolina Association of Pharmacists, which is NCAP, and in 2015, Dr. Ames was named NCAP's Chronic Care Pharmacist of the Year. Throughout her career, Dr. Ames has also been honored with the NCPA Pharmacy Leadership Award and the McKesson Leadership Award. And on her off time, which I can't believe she has a lot of off times, she's an avid runner, and she's actually run in 4 Boston marathons. So welcome, Dr. Ames.
Excellent. Well, thank you for the kind introduction, Paula. And I'm really excited to be here with you today, and really thankful that Leading Age Virginia asked me to join you guys today to talk about COVID vaccines. So, at this point, I think we all understand the potential detrimental outcomes of COVID, particularly with the patient population that we take care of in this group. And anything that we can do to safely prevent or mitigate its impact would definitely be a welcome change in long-term care. And I think everybody can understand how vaccines are going to be a forefront part of that discussion that we have when it comes to that. So moving on, let's see, we'll get here into our objectives for today. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, and hopefully you all know what they are by the end. I want to talk about Operation Warp Speed, what that is, and how the distribution network for vaccines kind of fits into that plan. We'll talk about the timeline for vaccines, when we think they'll get to market, what that looks like, as well as go through the list of the vaccines that we have in the pipeline, those that are in clinical trials, especially those that are in phase 3, those final stages. And then we'll talk about some of the challenges of mass vaccination that I think everybody probably anticipates when it comes to the COVID vaccine. So just a little stats to get us started when we talk about COVID-19. Right now, I looked at the data through the month of October, and we've averaged about 770 COVID-19 deaths per day in the United States throughout the course of the month. And, it's obviously scary, that next one there, that it's on track to be the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States this year. So, with that, I think everybody understands why we're putting so much emphasis on a way to prevent this and the vaccine pipeline. And so, there's a number of players that have come in and tried to produce candidates for this. And so, as of last week, there were 14 vaccines in human trials around the world. So that would be what we consider phase 2 and phase 3 of clinical trials. And we got 10 right now that are in that final stage of efficacy and safety in humans, with a vast population of volunteers that are part of that. So, and 5 of those right now are in the United States. The other 5 are split between China and Russia. And all those candidates in the US are part of Operation Warp Speed. And one thing is, this is basically a full-time job trying to keep up with the data as it changes and where these studies are from day to day and week to week. So just a little bit about Operation Warp Speed, since that is really what's the primary motive behind this whole advanced and fast-tracked vaccine to market. And really, as I have there, the primary goal of this whole thing was to produce and deliver 300 million doses of safe and effective COVID-19 vaccine by January 2021. So, obviously an incredibly fast and accelerated process compared to what, a normal vaccine would go through before it hits the marketplace. And as part of this, we'll talk about the phases of development, manufacturing, and distribution, how the government is pushing more rapid availability of this. And as well as their funding that's going into it. There's a lot of money that's been earmarked for this particular initiative. and it's all being paid with taxpayer dollars. So the positive to that is, when these vaccines come to market, they're not going to be at any cost to the American population since the government already paid for them. So, and this expands not just to vaccines, but what they consider countermeasures. So when you hear them speak about countermeasures, that includes our vaccines as well as therapeutics and diagnostics that are also part of this initiative that they're looking to kind of put a fast track on some advancement with prevention for COVID. So when we talk about the primary partners in this, there's an awful lot of players that are part of this government partnership. And the primary ones that you're going to hear the most about that play different parts of this is Health and Human Services, the CDC, the FDA, NIH, BARDA, which if you're not familiar with that, it's the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, and then the Department of Defense. And there's several other government agencies that are part of this that are playing smaller roles. But primarily, it's these 6 that are really driving the whole Operation Warp Speed and how it progresses along. And I won't get into the breakdown that you can see there, but ultimately, it's $10 billion that the federal government put into this fast track of vaccinations, which is a pretty impressive number. When we're talking about how quickly this whole thing happened and getting these vaccines to market. So with Operation Warp Speed, talking a little bit about the development piece of this, and this is really where the federal government's been incredibly aggressive about getting a vaccine to the marketplace for us. There's financial support that's been out there, so a number of candidates, over 100 different vaccines were out there in submission for this, and they narrowed it down to 14 and then further narrowed it down to 7 for further testing. And we'll get into the details of some of the vaccines that are there. There's right now, like I said, we have 5 that are in that final phase of clinical trials in the United States that are funded partially by Operation Warp Speed. The other thing they did was align the safety and efficacy protocols for these. So, in normal circumstances, any vaccine that would go through, the testing process to get to marketplace, mostly it's independent agencies that take on the drug studies and provide oversight for those. At each step along the way, they have to submit protocols for how they're going to conduct their study and how the vaccine process is going to be tested. And then that goes through 3 phases of clinical trials, which, the first phase is typically in animals. It's just a small study to look at safety. Phase 2 expands to humans, and that's where they start to look at limited safety and efficacy data. And then phase 3, which is really the drugs that we'll hear about, through this whole vaccine process, are the ones that are now in stages of widespread clinical trials with, huge volunteer bases. But each one of those steps requires approval through the FDA. And the one thing the government did with Operation Warp Speed was they set those protocols up front. So, there's not all this time wasted and spent in the background trying to agree on what the protocol is going to be and get approval for that. So, it avoids those delays by just setting the set protocol from the start to push the whole process through trials a little bit quicker. And then the last thing is some enhanced manufacturing capacity that we'll get into in a little bit more detail in the next slide. So with that, the next 2 phases of things that are also part of Operation Warp Speed are the advanced manufacturing and distribution planning that's going on. And with the manufacturing piece, this is where the government's invested in a big financial risk into this. So, most companies that would produce a drug or vaccine, they would wait until they have the approval process to push their drug into manufacturing. Where in this case, the government's doing those steps and planning for that before that there's a drug approved in the marketplace. And so they're really taking the financial risk on of that to speed up the whole process of having the drug into production once we have one approved through the FDA. And then the last piece of this is the distribution channel planning that's going on behind the scenes. And this is primarily coordinated between the Department of Defense, Health and Human Services, and the CDC. And that's where Friday's announcement came from. That you heard about with the long-term care pharmacy partnership. That's all part of this advanced planning for the whole distribution network for vaccines once there is one available. As part of this, they're also ramping up the production of things that go along with the vaccine. So not just the medication, the preservatives that we're talking about, but things like prefilled syringes, vials, containers. All those things are being produced in advance of the anticipation of one of these vaccines making it into the marketplace. They've also named a central distributor, McKesson. They have some experience with this. They were the company that was tasked with the H1N1 vaccine about 10 years back. So they certainly have some experience and aren't going into this whole process blind, unlike most of us, it seems, that are all part of trying to figure out how all this is going to happen when a vaccine comes to market. So, we have several agencies across the country that are also working on the planning. And, when it comes to the long-term care pharmacy partners and the pharmacies that you contract and work with, the vast majority of them are working with the American Society of Consultant Pharmacists to make sure that long-term care pharmacies are able to participate in this whole process and are going to be able to support you when you go to do your vaccine administrations and handle this within your facilities. So, all right, let's talk a little bit about what this distribution process is going to look like. The vaccination is going to happen in 3 distinct phases, and it's all based off of vaccine availability. And what you're hearing about now with Friday's announcement is part of phase 1. Which is split into A and B. And so phase 1A is going to include our healthcare workers. And then once we reach phase B, which is a little bit more availability, but still limited, that's when it's going to expand and start to include vaccinations for your long-term care facility residents. And so at that point in time, vaccines are still going to be in limited supply. It's very much prioritized populations that they are trying to figure out how do we get them to these people and make those vaccinations happen. We're looking at those groups that are most critical. Again, healthcare workers, long-term care residents. One of the things that I think is going to factor into this is the first vaccine we expect to come to market is likely not going to be approved for anyone over the age of 65. And so I think that's why that first, one of the big reasons that first phase 1A didn't necessarily include long-term care residents was simply because it's probably not going to be get the approval for that patient population. And again, this is where the medication is federally allocated. It's going to go between the State Department and those retail pharmacies that were mentioned, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then once we get into phase 2, that's when we're going to see more, mass vaccinations of the general population. We're going to have a ramped up supply as well as a broader administration network than at the beginning. Still federally allocated, but most likely through your state health departments. And then once we get to phase 3, that's going to be more like what we're used to with flu vaccine these days, where you can go almost anywhere and get it. It's just, it can be sent straight to your facilities for administration, readily available. Obviously, we're a little ways off from that right now. The next slide that I put up here is just the CDC illustration of that same thing. I just mostly there for reference. It's a little bit easier to look at that way, but this is, that circle that's on there, that is where we're going to, where we'll see vaccination of the long-term care facility residents. Like I said, still limited supply, central distribution, but just another way to look at that. All right, so when we talk about your long-term care vaccine providers, this is part of the announcement that came out Friday that announced there's 2 partners with the federal government for providing vaccinations, and that is Walgreens and CVS. I think everybody's pretty well aware of that at this point. But also as part of phase 1B in that same timeline, there's going to be the ability for your long-term care pharmacy partners that you have now, the pharmacies that you use and are familiar with, to be part of that program. And so, with that, there's obviously a lot of I think for the long-term care pharmacies, those vaccines are most likely going to be allocated to us from the state health departments, whereas Walgreens and CVS are going to receive theirs directly from the federal government. Everybody's asking the question, what's going to be the quickest? What's going to be the fastest way for us to get those vaccines? And really, your guess is as good as mine when it comes to that. There's just a lot of unknowns out there right now when it comes to that, a lot of questions around it. Obviously CVS and Walgreens are going to have, that direct link with the federal government allocations. There's obviously some benefits to working with your pharmacy partners that you're accustomed to. And that's, when you think about there's over 15,000 long-term care facilities in the United States, I'm not sure how CVS and Walgreens are going to be able to prioritize that volume of people that they don't, in facilities that they don't have relationships with. So there's definitely going to be challenges both ways. And, the thing I think at this point that you need to understand is any of the choices that you make on those questionnaires that came out that were announced Friday, non-binding, you can change your mind at any point in time. We'll talk about the survey here in a minute. where you have the 2 weeks to make your initial choices, but you can always work with your pharmacies after the fact if you want to change your mind about who you would like your provider to be. And essentially, no matter who you choose, whether it's the CVS Walgreens option or the pharmacy that you're contracted and familiar with, the cost and the way the program is going to be provided is going to be the same. We all have the same obligations, and I'll get into those kind of as we move along here a little bit. All right, so when it comes to selecting, this was the announcement that came out to you Friday, either from your state health department or CMS, I think also had a press release that they came out with, that the skilled buildings and the assisted living buildings have the two different ways that they go in and elect their participation in this program. And those options were available for choice starting on the 19th and are going to be open for 2 weeks. A couple important points with that as far as how it's been explained to us in the pharmacy sector is, participation isn't necessarily required, but if you do opt out, you have to have a plan for providing vaccines. Whether that is through one of the choices that are available to you there or something that you kind of figure out on your own. Obviously they're making it a little bit easier for you to be able to partner with one of the retail providers or your long-term care pharmacy. And like I said, you can make changes later on. It's just you have to work directly with your pharmacy versus the online survey, but that's always something that can be worked through. And again, when you think about this is what is all intended for that phase 1B of vaccination. And it's really intended to last about a 2-month period where they expect us to be in that stage before, vaccines are more readily available and the distribution channels will be a little bit wider at that point. All right, so this is what your survey is going to look like if you're from the skilled center. I don't know if the ALF one looks exactly the same or similar. Obviously, what I fill out here is your little prompts for how you go about choosing your particular long-term care pharmacy. Obviously, since that's the sector I work in, and we have some great partners in our long-term care facilities that we service, and want to be the ones that are there supporting them since we have that relationship. So these were the choices that you'd have to make on that questionnaire if you do want to partner with your existing pharmacy, which, like I said, is completely acceptable. And those pharmacies are going to provide the same things that CVS and Walgreens are going to provide to you through this whole thing, with the benefit of having the personnel that you know and trust to take care of you. So, that said, this is how you would complete that form if you want to use your existing pharmacy. I would encourage you to check with your long-term care pharmacies. I know for us at Pruitt, we did reach out to all of our customers, let all our facilities know that we intended to be part of the vaccine provider network. And be available for them to be able to provide those. So anyway, like I said, I would encourage you to have those discussions, just make sure they intend to be part of that program. But I think everybody understands the importance of this with the population that we take care of. And I would anticipate most long-term care pharmacies have an interest in participating. All right, what do those obligations look like for the pharmacies that are part of this program? Like I said, again, the clinics and the vaccines themselves are at no cost to the long-term care facilities. So that is, and like I said, these obligations are going to be the same whether you choose your current pharmacy or you choose the Walgreens or CVS option. That pharmacy is going to oversee the management of the entire vaccine process, from the administration to scheduling the clinic days with you. We'll go through what that's going to look like here in just a moment. They're going to oversee the cold chain management, the storage. And these first 2 drugs that are expected to come to market have some really challenging logistics of the storage that's required for them. And we'll get into some of those details as we move on. But it certainly makes it a challenge. When you administer the vaccines, there's also reconstitution that has to be done in specific dosing. And that's one of the reasons I think they really task pharmacy with this, is the drug experts with such narrow storage requirements and windows, as well as the specific dosing and reconstitution. It just seemed like pharmacy, that's our area of expertise and where we can offer a lot in assisting through this whole thing. And then also the pharmacy is going to be required for fulfilling any reporting requirements, which there are some to the state and or federal government through the CDC portal it's going to be out there. So that's what your pharmacy will take care of for you, no matter who it is that you choose to provide that service. All right, so moving on to what these clinic days will look like. So as part of this program, again, the pharmacies commit to the CDC to setting up the standard clinic setup for providing vaccines to your facilities. They'll set up 3 days with you at very specific intervals, and those are all based on the dosing protocols by these vaccines. And so almost every one of the vaccines that is getting close to market is a 2-step vaccination. That's 1 dose followed by a 2nd dose anywhere from 14 to 28 days later in most cases. And so that's where the intervals of these clinics are set up at. And so the pharmacy partner you choose, whether that's the retail option or your long-term care pharmacy, they would set up with you these 3 days. They would come in the first day, vaccinate all your residents and staff. They would schedule that 2nd day when the 2nd dose is due, either at 21 or 28 days, depending on which product comes to market. At that clinic, they would provide a 2nd dose for everybody vaccinated at the first one, and then pick up any new residents and staff that had started in that interim or were admitted. And then the 3rd clinic, again, is in another interval that would provide the 2nd dose for those who received the 1st dose at the 2nd clinic, and then pick up anybody new. And then at that point, we should have reached that 2-month mark where we start to see more normal vaccination services, and we'll transition to something that you're more accustomed to with the way pharmacy provides vaccines for you. And again, at each stage of the ball game here, the pharmacy is going to be completing all that reporting requirement that goes along with this. So the reporting is pretty extensive. It's definitely going to be something that's time consuming. And right now, I think these might still be draft elements that are required as part of this. But there's a number of things that need to be collected on each one of every patient and every staff that receives the vaccine. And the pharmacy, like I said, is going to take care of this for you. And this will either be entered into the state portal or the CDC portal. It's not yet created, but I'm sure will be fast-tracked along with everything else. And this is all required that this is done within 72 hours of the vaccine being administered. So, one of the 2 key things there that they are reporting is the ethnicity and race when we do the vaccinations, and that has to do with the different COVID outcomes that they've seen between different racial and ethnic minority groups. So it's definitely an analytic metric that they're trying to look at as far as the outcomes of these vaccines and how they work. All right, so some challenges that we got with the proposed process. There's definitely a lot of things to sort out, a lot of questions out there, not just for the long-term care facilities, but for the pharmacies that are participating as part of this. Just a few things that haven't been defined is the whole reimbursement structure. So like I said, while the vaccines are going to be free of charge, there's a cost burden that comes with it, with how the administration is going to be reimbursed. And it's going to be something similar that you're accustomed to with flu vaccines, where there's a rate. Nobody knows what that is yet. Obviously, there's an extensive documentation and tracking that goes along with this that makes it a little bit more complex than flu vaccine. There's certainly some staffing challenges, around this. That, none of these pharmacies, whether it's CVS, Walgreens, or your long-term care pharmacy, had a whole team of people sitting around waiting to vaccinate the entire country. So, trying to drum up those people that are able to do that and have the ability to immunize people is definitely going to be a challenge, and to do that quickly. There's some storage concerns that come along with this. We talked about the ultra cold storage with these first 2 products that are going to be coming to market. They're stored at very unusual and uncommon temperatures. And so that's definitely going to limit the ability of some providers to be able to even store these products. And then when we start talking about the 2nd step, the ability not only to provide it, but also track, who's received it, who hasn't, particularly as you have admissions coming and going, discharges, leaving your facilities, trying to figure out who's been vaccinated. The other thing with this is there's an interchangeability between the different products. So if you received your 1st dose as the Pfizer product, your 2nd dose has to be the Pfizer product as well. And so, you can't mix and match those, the different vaccines. All right, talking a little bit about the timeline, like I have here, it depends on who you ask and how you ask it when you get an answer on this. And, obviously Trump has taken this as a big political platform. He was doing a big push to get this vaccine out before Election Day, which I think everybody realizes is not going to happen. When you talk to Fauci, he was probably a little bit more realistic in this and thinking the first vaccines would be available November, December timeframe. than widely available by the time we hit the second quarter of 2021. So Louis, who's over Operation Warp Speed, expects that our first emergency authorization is going to be around the Thanksgiving timeframe, which right now looks like that might be the case. And then you have the CDC director, Robert Redfield. When you ask him and he starts talking about that widespread mass vaccination, we're looking more at like the second or third quarter of 2021 when we start talking about having the entire population or a big chunk of it vaccinated. And that depends on a couple things. I mentioned that emergency use authorization, and that's really the FDA's fast track process. It's not as stringent as a full FDA approval process that most drugs or vaccines would undergo, but it's an emergency process that again speeds up this whole getting a vaccine to market. And so one piece of that is, as the FDA reviews this, there's an outside vaccine advisory committee that's made up of people from, like I said, infectious disease experts outside the FDA that can either endorse or, go against approving the emergency use authorization of any vaccine that comes to market. And so there's definitely some pros and cons there. If the FDA would push a product through that didn't have the endorsement of that committee, there would definitely be a big red flag there, and it would probably limit public acceptance of that. So, like I said, a realistic time frame for this is to think around Thanksgiving is most likely when we're going to see the first drugs go through the approval process. And there's definitely been some conflicting opinions even within the FDA of how they're going to do that. Like I said, these are all 2-dose series of vaccines. There's been a lot of question around what percentage of the participants need to have the second dose, how long after that second dose do we have to wait before we request authorization, and everybody's encouraging that 2-month time frame after the vast majority of participants have the second dose. So just a little bit to think about. COVID's been around since the first of the year. To the fact we're even discussing vaccines at this point is pretty incredible, considering the fastest vaccines in history that have made it in the market in the US have taken 5 to 6 years to get there. And we're talking about a less than 12-month time frame to do this. So, certainly impressive and a little bit concerning at the same time. All right, so getting into our specific vaccines, there's 3 types of vaccines primarily that are out there in phase 3 clinical trials. We got the RNA vaccines, the inactivated vaccines, and the adenovirus vector vaccines. So the first one, the RNA vaccines, these are our leading candidates to be the first to come to marketplace. This is the Pfizer and the Moderna products that you're hearing so much about right now. And it works with a little different technology than anything that's been used before. And essentially produces proteins in the body that resemble the virus, and it teaches your body how to fight COVID. Is the technology behind this. And some of the pros for this is the rapid scalability. So it's with these type of products, it's very easy to create large volumes very quickly. And we've seen good results from the initial data that are coming out of these drug studies. Some of the negatives with it is, like I said, this is new and unknown technology. We don't really know what to expect from it. We don't understand, long-term what might come out of these products like we can with other vaccines that we're more familiar with the science behind them. As I mentioned, there's some challenging storage demands. These are the ultra-cold storage products that require special freezers to be able to store and distribute them. And every single one of these are going to be a 2-step vaccine, as we talked about. So the next one's the inactivated vaccines. These have a long-standing history. We have plenty of vaccines in the marketplace that use this method of science for working. So with that historical experience, we know what to expect from them. And I think everybody's probably more comfortable with the way that they work and the science behind them. A couple negatives to the inactivated vaccines is they tend to be expensive. They're difficult to produce on a large scale, where we talked about the RNA vaccines being so easy to produce in large volumes. These are much more challenging. And again, these are another 2-step vaccine that we would have to worry about how to administer that second step as well. And then lastly, the third type vaccine that's out there is the adenovirus vector vaccines. And essentially it uses a vaccine or a virus similar to what COVID is, to teach your body how to have an immune response to it when you're subject to COVID. And so these tend to produce a good immune response. That's one of the positives to them. And these ones also have the potential to be a single dose vaccine. Some of them are still 2-dose, but this is the one type of technology that has the potential to be a standalone vaccine, much like our flu vaccine is today. Some of the negatives with this is some of those adenoviruses that they're using are familiar to humans. They have them and have had adenovirus vaccines, and that can limit the immune response and make the vaccine not quite as effective. So we'll get into a couple of the specific products here. So the one that everybody's hearing about right now, Pfizer, this is our leading candidate to come to market. It's one of those RNA vaccines that we discussed, the 2-dose, 21 days apart. And this is the biggest challenge with this one is the storage. So it has to be stored at -94 Fahrenheit. So ultra cold storage, special freezers that we're talking about to handle this. And once it's thawed under normal refrigeration, it has very limited stability, as well as once it gets to room temperature, that window of administration time is going to be incredibly narrow with this particular product. And so it's made its way through to phase 3 of trials. There's, this study was one that was expanded to include a more diverse population. And it's also the first vaccine in the US that has plans to be tested in kids. So they have plans to expand the study to children that are 12 years old and older. And so, one of the concerns with this particular product, like I said, although it's likely to be the first to market, there's concerns it hasn't been as effective in the elderly population. And so I'm not certain that when this one's approved, that it's going to be approved for anybody over the age of 65. But like I said, this is the one that we're most likely going to see in that phase 1A when we're limited to just healthcare worker vaccinations. All right, our second product and second leading candidate for approval in the US is the Moderna product. This is probably the other one that you hear the most about in the news next to Pfizer. Again, this is a 2-dose series, 28 days apart for this particular one. Again, that would set your clinic days. And this one, they're seeking approval for 18 years of age and older. Storage, a little bit less challenging than the Pfizer product. It's -4 Fahrenheit, so still outside that range of normal freezers that we're accustomed to. I haven't seen too much yet about the extended stability with this once it gets to room temperature or normal refrigeration, but I would hope it would be a little bit easier to manage than the Pfizer product that we've seen. And again, this is another one that we expect that the data is going to be submitted to the FDA sometime through the month of November. All right, 2 other products. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these. These are 2 products in China that are also in phase 3 of trials. I think the one thing that's notable about these is the Sinovac product, that first one. Again, an inactivated virus. So, the positive with this, we're used to that technology. 2 doses, 14 days apart. This is the one study that was restricted to just healthcare workers. They try to target that high-risk population. I think one of the drawbacks then is they haven't had much success with their recruitment for the study. The last numbers I saw for it were in early October, and I think there were only about 1,200 healthcare workers enrolled in this, shy of their goal of near 9,000 there. But like I said, both of these are in Chinese studies, and I don't know that we've really lent a whole lot of weight to either of these. They haven't got much attention in the United States, and I don't know that we're going to hear much about them as far as an actual candidate for vaccines in the US marketplace. The next one we'll talk about, this is our first vector vaccine from AstraZeneca. And this one is probably the number 3 as far as the drugs that we expect to come to market. And this one uses a chimpanzee adenovirus. And so, it avoids that one problem that we have with vector vaccines that, if there's something that's common in humans, we might not elicit an immune response that's going to be enough to provide solid vaccination for everybody. And so, being that they use something that's not common in humans, we avoid that problem with this. Again, another 2-step vaccine. This one's 28 days apart. And the company, while they haven't come out with their storage protocols, they do say it's going to be something a little bit more normal, what we're used to with other vaccines. So hopefully that would be normal refrigeration or freezing temperatures that we can handle with standard freezers. And again, this is one that right now is on hold in the US. So there is a little bit of a delay with this one. It was paused with a patient out of the UK that had a neurological event. I don't know that anybody actually thinks it's linked to the vaccine, but they did halt the study worldwide for it. It got resumed elsewhere, but like I said, last I saw, it still wasn't reinitiated in the US. But again, like I said, still pretty hopeful that this is one that could potentially make it to market for us here. All right, another product we got out there, the J&J or the Janssen product. This is one that's getting a lot of recent attention. Again, another adenovirus vaccine, and they're using the same concept that J&J used in the past when they produced the Ebola virus vaccine. So something we're familiar with. One of the positives of this one is they're looking at a single dose regimen. So it avoids that complication of how to get the two-step vaccine for any of the residents that we would vaccinate with this. The one thing they're not clear about right now with this one is if the elderly are going to have the same effectiveness as the younger population. And where their concern comes from this is, with the side effects they've seen, it's been much less in the elderly than it was in the younger volunteers that received this. And so, with that, they think it's because there's less of an immune response. So I'm not entirely sure if this one hits market, that it would be approved for our patient population. But again, this is one that most recently entered phase 3. It was the fourth US product to go phase 3 of drug studies, and pretty extensive. Their plan was to have 60,000 participants, but this one's probably looking more like first quarter of 2021 before we'd actually see it in the marketplace. All right, we got two other ones here. Again, these are ones that are not in US studies, so I'm not going to spend too much time on them, both vector vaccines. Russia pushed the Gamaleya product through, although nobody knows if they've actually even finished the study, although they've given it approval. So again, two more products that are in that final phase of clinical trials around the world, but I don't anticipate that we're going to hear much about them when it comes to the US market. All right. Just a couple other ones that are out there. The Inovio one, that was one that was looking promising initially, but it was put on hold earlier this month with some questions from the FDA. I think they had 30 days to pose their response before we could see if this one would continue on with clinical trials. And then we have the Novavax product. This one is expected to enter phase 3 later this month. I believe it's already in phase 3 outside of the US, just not here. But again, it's two-step vaccination, more typical storage. So some positives there with the storage parameters. But just another one we might hear about since it is in the US drug studies. All right, getting into some of the questions and concerns that are around these vaccines. It's one thing to have a vaccine that's available, but it's another thing to have a vaccine that everybody's willing to get. And, I think everybody probably has some legitimate concerns with the speed these have been pushed through the drug study process onto the approval and production network. And so, I think we talked about some of the things, some of the reasons that was able to be sped up, that was done safely. Like I said, that we set those protocols for drug studies, so there weren't delays that way. We're ramping up manufacturing and distribution earlier than we would have with any other products. So there's certainly some legitimate reasons that we can get these products to market sooner than normal. But, obviously our studies aren't nearly as extensive. And so, when we get to those vaccines, it's going to be a real question how much of the US population is, or worldwide population even is going to be able and willing to take these. And so, with that, I think comes those legitimate safety questions. I think they had done a poll not long ago asking people how they, felt about the vaccine safety. And, about 80 people responded by saying they felt this was more politics driving it than science. And so, I think we're going to see some hesitation for vaccine administration with that. We don't know much about the long-term side effects and adverse events that occur with these. We've had a very limited time to study these drugs. When most of these studies got underway in the final phase of clinical trials around the August timeframe. Moving into October, we're just now finishing up second doses for our volunteer population. And so that doesn't give us a whole lot of time to understand what happens with these vaccines, after a year, after 2 years, after, multiple years of vaccinations. Everybody's cautious because of the speed of the approval process. Like I said, some of those things are very legitimate in how the government has fast-tracked these. Other things are just seem fast, and I certainly understand the cautions that people would have with that. We also have to talk about the general perception issues with vaccines. I think being as deep into COVID as we are, we were, 15 days to flatten the curve 7 months ago. And, with that, I think people are becoming a little bit hardened and insensitive to, just what a big impact COVID was and still is, just with the time that it's gone on and that it's starting to become more commonplace to everybody in the way they think about things. We had an anti-vaccine movement that's been long-standing, unfortunately, up until this point, where, people are very vocal about how they feel about vaccines and some of the misperceptions and myths around vaccines that were already out there even prior to COVID coming to market. And then you have the people out there that don't want to be told what to do. They don't think anybody should make recommendations, suggestions, mandates, that everything's against their civil liberty. You can't tell me what to do. We talked about the logistical challenges of distribution. The ultra cold storage poses a problem. How do we get vaccines to this many healthcare centers? Like we said, there's like 15,400 long-term care facilities across the country, and to try to make that happen in a very quick and narrow time frame, there's definitely some challenges. And I think we're seeing a lot of organizations partner together pretty effectively to try to solve that problem prior to all these things coming to market. Then we have to think about the time too and the ability for immunity. It's going to take a good percentage of the population to be able to be vaccinated before we have herd immunity and mass vaccination. And, I think everybody's willingness to accept this vaccine has decreased as time's gone on, and they've seen how fast this has gotten pushed through. And so, when they did a poll of the American population in May, 72% of people said they would be willing to get COVID vaccine, whereas the most recent one within the last month, that was down to about 51%. So, I think people's willingness to be open-minded to vaccination for this, that there's some hesitations out there. Like I said, some legitimate and other ones that can be explained. When we think about what percentage of the population it takes to receive vaccine, if 1/3 or 1/2 of our country's population is vaccinated, that's just not enough. And then the other thing to think about is the world's really a small place. People do a lot of traveling. The spread across the world pretty quickly. People don't stay in one place, and the wealthy nations have already bookmarked a lot of the vaccine that's going to come into production. And so when you think about that, countries like the U.S. and Britain and Japan, about 51% of the initial vaccine supply is already flagged for 13% of the world's population. So that leaves a good part of the world that's not going to be vaccinated through this whole process. And certainly one of the challenges, like I said, when we think about how easily and how widely people tend to travel. All right, so getting down to the end, just a quick summary of where we're at with everything. Obviously there's many vaccines in the pipeline. There's more to come out there. We have some things that are out there looking very, very promising, and there's been big incentives for these companies to do this and to fast track this and come up with a safe and effective product that we can get to market and handle this issue pretty quickly. So Operation Warp Speed, that's the driving force that's been behind all this to help expedite this whole development process, the manufacturing, the distribution, and really resolve the whole planning around mass vaccinations in the US when it comes to COVID. We touched on all those different types of technologies that are out there. Some of them we're familiar with and have historical perspectives of, other ones that are new to us and are promising, but a little bit of an unknown. And so when we start talking about that timeline, because that's everybody's real question at this point, I think we're going to see that first approval of a drug probably around that Thanksgiving timeframe. If we can really get the distribution channels fast-tracked and the production, it's possible that we would be moving into phase 1A or 1B of vaccination before the end of the year. I think the first quarter of 2021, we're definitely going to be talking about vaccinations and how these all fit in there. But there's just so many variables out there, from the production timeline, the FDA approval process, how exactly that's going to happen, how this allocation is going to occur through the federal government and the state agencies. So just a lot of unknowns, a lot of questions out there. We learn more every day. We're advancing a little bit farther, and it is an exciting thing to be part of. So anyway, with that kind of wraps up what I had planned by way of the presentation, and I did want to leave enough time here for questions for anybody that had anything they wanted to ask. I mean, I know there was a lot of information that came out Friday with the long-term care partnership with pharmacies. If anybody has questions about that I can help with, or anything else vaccine related, fire away.
You can either put questions in the chat box or go ahead and open up your mic and then just ask the question. No questions? Come on.
Now I left all this time.
There were so many
I must have
questions.
answered, just explained everything perfectly.
You did. What's the efficacy of flu vaccines?
You know, the flu vaccines, last I saw, tend to be between 60 and 80% effective for the flu vaccine. The one important, I'm a big proponent of flu vaccines, so you're on my other platform here, Paula, when you're asking those questions. But the one key thing to keep in mind with flu vaccine is that the end point for flu vaccine, you can't just think about preventing the flu. That's not ultimately the goal of flu vaccine. We know we can't prevent it with the vaccine. You know, every year they choose the strains that they think are going to be most prominent to prevent. But really, when we think about flu vaccine, we have to think about all those other metrics that we measure, things like mortality, reduced hospital stays, reduced ICU admissions. You know, when you think about the vaccines, people who get the flu, even if they've been vaccinated for the flu, tend to not get as sick. They spend 4 fewer days in the hospital versus those who end up in the hospital and aren't vaccinated. You know, when you think about kids, 3 out of 4 kids that die from the flu weren't vaccinated. You know, there's tremendous positives that come along with the flu vaccine. You know, even if you're vaccinated and still get the flu, there's positives there. And so I think that's one thing everybody needs to keep in mind with that. And then when we start talking about efficacy with COVID vaccine, they're thinking right now, the initial thought is it's going to be 80 to 90% effective. So a little bit better than what we're used to with typical flu vaccines.
Anybody else? All right. Well, Michelle, thank you so much for this enlightening webinar, because I know it was very technical, but you made it easier for all of us to understand about everything.
There's so much information out there. It's definitely a lot to try to digest. And you know, I keep telling everybody it's turned into a part-time job to try to be the expert when it comes to the vaccine, because everything changes on a daily basis and there's so much stuff coming out there. But you know, I think the take-home point for everybody, you know, particularly for the facilities trying to decide how to make their choices, you know that your pharmacies are going to be able to provide the same services that you know, your retail partners are going to be able to do. Everybody's here to support you, you know, no matter which pharmacy you choose. You know, and stay in communication with your own pharmacy as far as how they plan to participate. And they can help guide you along with that too. You know, obviously at Pruitt, we intend to be part of that, and we feel it's highly important for us to support our customers when it comes to this initiative and be there to help walk them through this process. So, you know, certainly if you have questions, I would encourage each of you to reach out to your contracted pharmacies and talk to them about provision of this service for you. You know, like I said, I can't emphasize enough that I think that partnership and that familiarity is going to be really important when it comes to providing vaccinations once there's one in the marketplace.
Good advice. Thank you. Well, thank you again, Michelle, and thank you, Pamela, for helping us to get this out to all of our members. We certainly appreciate it, and thank you all for being on the call.